The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished steps of Metro City Police Department as Officer James Keller pulled into his usual parking spot. His coffee had spilled on his freshly pressed uniform during the drive, and his ex-wife's angry voicemail about missed child support payments still rang in his ears. It wasn't going to be a good day. 20 years on the force had left their mark on Keller. The once idealistic rookie had grown bitter, his wedding ring replaced by a pale band of untamed skin. His dreams of making a difference faded like an old photograph. The streets he patrolled hadn't changed much, but he had. Each passing year had hardened him a little more, each domestic dispute and drug bust adding another layer to the wall he'd built around himself. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Keller noticed a tall black man in an expensive-looking suit standing near the department entrance, checking something on his phone. The man's presence shouldn't have bothered him, but something about the way he carried himself, confident, unafraid, rubbed Keller the wrong way. "Hey, you can't loiter here," Keller called out, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. The man looked up from his phone, his expression calm and professional. "Good morning, officer," the man replied, his voice steady and measured. "I'm not loitering. I have a meeting inside." Keller's fingers drummed against his belt as he approached. The morning sun caught the man's gold cufflinks, probably worth more than Keller made in a week. "Yeah, with who?" "I don't believe that's any of your concern, officer," the man responded, maintaining his composure. "But I assure you I have every right to be here." Something in the man's tone, was it confidence or condescension, made Keller's blood boil. All the morning's frustrations, all the years of pent-up anger and prejudice suddenly found their target. "Listen here," Keller growled, stepping closer, invading the man's personal space. "I decide what's my concern around here. Show me some ID." The man straightened his tie, a simple gesture that somehow made Keller feel small. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but you're overstepping. I've done nothing wrong, and you have no probable cause to demand identification." The man's knowledge of his rights only infuriated Keller more. Who did this guy think he was? A couple of younger officers exited the building, glancing uncertainly at the scene unfolding before them. "You think you know the law better than me?" Keller's face reddened. 20 years I've been keeping these streets safe from people who don't know their place." The man's eyebrows raised slightly at the implied meaning behind those words. "Officer, I suggest you think carefully about your next actions. We both know what this is really about." That calm certainty, that quiet dignity, it was too much for Keller. Before he could stalk himself, before his brain could catch up with his anger, he did something that would change both their lives forever. He spat. The glob of saliva landed on the man's polished shoe, a disgusting punctuation mark to this ugly encounter. The younger officers gasped. A passing civilian quickly pulled out their phone, recording. But the man in the suit didn't flinch. He simply looked down at his shoe, then back up at Keller, his eyes filled not with anger but with something worse, pity. "Officer Keller," he said, reading the nameplate on Keller's uniform. "Thank you for making my first day here so illuminating." With that, the man walked past Keller and through the department doors, leaving behind a very confused and increasingly uneasy officer. The morning sun continued to climb in the sky, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded beneath it, unaware that this was just the beginning of a story that would shake the Metro City Police Department to its core. As Keller watched the man disappear into the building, a creeping sensation began to work its way up his spine. Something about the man's parting words felt ominous. First day here. The thought barely had time to form before he was distracted by the buzz of his radio, a domestic disturbance call across town. Keller got back into his patrol car, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. He'd deal with whatever consequences came from this later. Right now, he had a job to do, blissfully unaware that tomorrow morning would bring the biggest shock of his career. The next morning arrived with the usual buzz of activity at the Metro City Police Department. Officer Keller slouched in his chair in the crowded meeting room, coffee in hand, trying to shake off memories of yesterday's incident. Around him, his fellow officers chatted about weekend plans and ongoing cases, their voices creating a familiar morning rumble. "Heard we're getting the new chief today," Officer Chen whispered from the seat next to him. "They say he's some hotshot from downtown, cleaned up one of the worst precincts in the city." Keller grunted in response. After 20 years, he'd seen chiefs come and go, each with their grand plans for reform that never amounted to much. He took another sip of his coffee, bitter and burning hot, just how he liked it. Captain Rodriguez stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat. The room gradually fell silent. "Good morning, everyone. As you all know, today marks a new chapter for our department. But before I introduce our new chief, let me remind you that last night's domestic violence response reports are due by end of shift." A few officers shuffled papers, others tapped on their phones under the table. Keller stifled a yawn. Just another Monday morning meeting. "And now," Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "it gives me great pleasure to introduce our new chief of police." The door at the back of the room opened. Keller's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Walking down the center aisle was the man from yesterday, the same man he'd harassed, the same man he'd spat at. Only now, instead of a business suit, he wore the crisp uniform of a police chief, 4 stars gleaming on each collar. The room erupted in applause, but to Keller it sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand, a few drops spilling onto his pants. He barely noticed. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez," the new chief said, taking his place at the podium. His voice carried the same calm authority it had yesterday, but now it filled the entire room. "For those who haven't heard of me, I'm Chief Richardson. I've spent the last 15 years working my way up through various precincts, most recently serving as Deputy Chief Downtown." Keller felt the blood drain from his face as Chief Richardson's eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly, very briefly, on him. Was that a flicker of recognition? The coffee in Keller's stomach turned to acid. "I believe in leading by example," Richardson continued. "I believe in accountability at all levels. And most importantly, I believe that every single person who walks through our doors, whether they wear a badge or not, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Several officers nodded in agreement. Officer Chen scribbled notes enthusiastically. But Keller sat frozen, remembering yesterday's glob of spit on the chief's shoe. "Some of you may have already met me," Richardson said, a slight pause following his words. "Others will get to know me soon enough. I plan to spend time with each unit, understanding your challenges, your needs, and your perspectives." Keller's collar felt too tight. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. Around him, his colleagues listened attentively, unaware of the personal hell he was experiencing. He wanted to sink into his chair, to disappear completely. "Change isn't always comfortable," Richardson continued, his words seeming to pierce directly into Keller's consciousness. "But it's necessary. This department has a good foundation, but we can do better. We must do better. And that starts today." The meeting continued with regular announcements and updates, but Keller heard none of it. His mind raced through possible scenarios: resignation, transfer, demotion. Maybe if he acted quickly, he could get ahead of this somehow. As the meeting wrapped up and officers began filing out, Keller stayed glued to his seat. He watched as various department heads approached Richardson, introducing themselves, shaking hands, laughing at jokes he couldn't hear. "Officer Keller." Richardson's voice cut through the remaining chatter like a knife. Keller looked up to find the chief standing directly in front of him, the room now nearly empty. "My office. 10 minutes." With that, Richardson turned and walked away, leaving Keller alone with his thoughts and the cold remains of his coffee. Through the windows, the morning sun continued its climb into the sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below, unaware that this was just the second act in a story of redemption that would reshape not just 2 lives, but an entire department. The next 10 minutes would feel like the longest of Officer James Keller's career. As he watched the second-hand tick by on the wall clock, he couldn't help but wonder if this was how karma worked, not as a distant, abstract concept, but as a very real, very immediate consequence of one's actions. The walk to the chief's office would feel like walking to his own judgment day, each step heavy with the weight of yesterday's choices. The walk to Chief Richardson's office felt like the longest journey of Officer Keller's life. Each step on the polished floor echoed through the hallway, matching the pounding of his heart. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock his dark mood, casting long shadows that reminded him of prison bars. Outside the chief's office, his secretary nodded for him to go right in. Keller's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. Inside, Chief Richardson stood looking out the window, his hands clasped behind his back, still as a statue. "Close the door, Officer Keller." The quiet click of the door closing sounded like a jail cell locking. Keller stood at attention, his police training kicking in during this moment of stress. The office still had moving boxes in the corners, family photos yet to be hung, but the large desk dominated the room like a judge's bench. 20 years on the force, Richardson said, still facing the window. "I read your file this morning. Decorated officer. Multiple commendations for bravery. Good arrest record." He turned slowly, fixing Keller with a steady gaze. "And yesterday, you spat on a civilian outside this building." Keller's throat went dry. "Sir, Richardson held up a hand. "Before you speak, I want you to know that everything that happened yesterday was recorded on security cameras, 3 different angles. The video has already been reviewed by Internal Affairs." The room seemed to spin slightly. Keller felt sweat forming on his forehead. "I could fire you right now," Richardson continued, walking to his desk. "In fact, most people would expect me to. The video alone is enough for termination. Add in the racial element and well." He let the words hang in the air. Keller found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "Sir, I understand if you want my badge. What I did was, there's no excuse." Richardson studied him for a long moment. "You're right, there is no excuse, but I'm more interested in understanding why. Why did the sight of a black man in a suit trigger such a reaction in you?" The question hit Keller like a physical blow. He'd been expecting anger, punishment, humiliation. This calm inquiry was somehow worse. I don't know, sir," he answered honestly, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "Let me tell you a story," Richardson said, gesturing for Keller to sit. 15 years ago, I was a rookie cop in the worst precinct downtown. First week on the job, one of my fellow officers, a white officer, refused to ride with me. Said he didn't trust his life with my kind. Know what I did?" Keller shook his head, sinking into the chair. "I requested him as my permanent partner." His slight smile crossed Richardson's face. "For 6 months we worked together. It was hell at first, but slowly things changed. We learned about each other's families, shared meals, saved each other's lives a few times. By the end of that year, he was my daughter's godfather." The chief leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "People can change, Officer Keller, but they need 2 things, opportunity and willingness. I'm offering you the opportunity. The question is, are you willing?" Keller felt something shift inside him, not a dramatic transformation, but a crack in the wall he'd built over the years. What exactly are you offering, sir?" "A choice," Richardson replied. "Option 1, you resign today. Clean break, decent references, no public scandal. Option 2, you commit to a 6-month program I'm developing. Intensive diversity training, community service, direct work with minority communities. No guarantee of keeping your job at the end, but a chance to prove yourself and maybe become part of the solution instead of the problem." Keller's mind raced. The easy choice would be resignation. Walk away, find another job, avoid the hard work and humiliation. But something in Richardson's story, in his offer of redemption, struck a chord. "The program," Richardson continued, "won't be easy. You'll face people who know what you did. You'll have to confront your own biases, deal with uncomfortable truths. Most officers in your position would take the easy way out." The morning sun had risen higher, its light now falling directly across the desk between them. In that moment, Keller saw himself clearly, not just the decorated officer, but the angry, prejudiced man he'd become. The man who would spit on another human being out of pure bias. "I'll take the program, sir," he said quietly, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "If you're willing to give me the chance, I want to do better." Richardson nodded slowly, but his expression remained serious. "Understand something, Officer Keller. This isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. One mistake, one slip-up, and you're done. I'm putting my own reputation on the line by giving you this chance." "I understand, sir. Do you?" Richardson stood, his presence filling the room. "Because tomorrow, when word of this gets around, and it will get around, half the department will think I'm crazy for not firing you, and the other half will think you're getting special treatment." The only thing that matters is what you do with this opportunity. As Keller left the office 20 minutes later, clutching a folder containing his new assignment details, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the easy hope of youth, but the harder, more valuable hope that comes with facing one's own failures and choosing to do better. The hallway that had felt like a walk to execution now felt like something else, perhaps a path to redemption. Though he didn't know it yet, this conversation would mark the beginning of not just his own transformation, but a larger change within the department itself. Word spread through the department like wildfire. By lunchtime, every officer, dispatcher, and clerk knew about what happened between Officer Keller and Chief Richardson. The break room fell silent when Keller entered, conversations dropping to whispers. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others watched him with obvious judgment. "Can't believe you're still here," Officer Brooks muttered as Keller poured his coffee. "If I'd done what you did, I'd be cleaning out my locker." Keller stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream create swirls in the dark liquid. "Chief Richardson believes in second chances," he replied quietly. "Second chances?" Brooks scoffed. "More like he's setting himself up for a discrimination lawsuit when he finally fires you. Smart move, really." The old Keller would have snapped back, maybe even started a fight. Instead, he just picked up his cup and walked away, Richardson's words echoing in his mind. "One mistake, one slip-up, and you're done." Back at his desk, Keller opened the folder containing his new assignment details. The rehabilitation program would start tomorrow. 8 hours of community service every weekend at a local youth center, twice weekly diversity training sessions, and regular meetings with community leaders. His regular patrol duties would be restricted to riding with senior officers who would evaluate his performance. "Officer Keller?" He looked up to find Lieutenant Wilson standing by his desk, her expression unreadable. "The chief wants you to meet your new partner." Following Wilson down the hallway, Keller noticed the sideways glances from his colleagues. Some seemed angry, others curious, a few even sympathetic. The department had never dealt with something quite like this before. In the briefing room stood Officer Washington, a veteran cop with 30 years on the force. Keller had seen him around, but never worked with him directly. Washington's reputation preceded him, tough but fair, respected by both fellow officers and the community. "Washington's volunteered to be your supervising officer," Wilson explained. "You'll be riding with him for the next 6 months." Washington stepped forward, his expression stern. "Let's get one thing straight, Keller. I'm not here to be your friend or your babysitter. I'm here because Chief Richardson believes you can change, and I respect his judgment. But you're going to have to prove yourself every single day." "Understood?" "Yes, sir." Keller nodded, feeling like a rookie all over again. Their first shift together started in awkward silence. As they patrolled the streets, Keller could feel Washington watching him, evaluating every interaction, every decision. They responded to a shoplifting call at a local convenience store where the suspect was a young black teenager. Keller approached the situation with newfound awareness, conscious of his words, his body language, his assumptions. He spoke to the kid respectfully, listened to his story about trying to steal food because his family's food stamps had run out. Instead of making an arrest, Keller worked with the store owner to arrange for the teenager to work off the debt. Back in the patrol car, Washington spoke for the first time in hours. "Not bad," he said simply. "But one good interaction doesn't erase what you did. This is just the beginning." That evening, Keller sat in his car outside the downtown youth center where he'd be starting his community service. Through the windows, he could see kids playing basketball, doing homework, laughing with friends. Tomorrow, he'd walk through those doors not as a police officer, but as someone trying to make amends. His phone buzzed, a text from his ex-wife. She'd heard about what happened and was threatening to use it in their custody battle. Keller closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. It would have been easier to resign, to run away from all this, but something kept him here, facing the consequences. Inside his apartment that night, Keller pulled out an old photo album. Pictures of his police academy graduation, his first day on the force, commendation ceremonies, moments when he'd felt proud to wear the badge. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of what that badge really meant. The last photo showed him with his daughter at her 10th birthday party, both of them smiling. She hadn't smiled at him like that in years. What would she think when she heard about what he'd done? How could he explain to her why her father had acted with such hatred? Keller's phone rang. Chief Richardson calling to confirm his first diversity training session tomorrow morning. As he answered, Keller realized this wasn't just about keeping his job anymore. It was about becoming someone his daughter could be proud of again, someone who lived up to the ideals he'd sworn to uphold when he first put on the badge. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But for the first time in years, Officer James Keller felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. The path ahead would be difficult, but at least now he was walking in the right direction. As he prepared for bed, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, older, tired, but also carrying a hint of something new. Maybe it was shame, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the first glimmer of real change beginning to take root. 3 months into his rehabilitation program, Officer Keller sat in the back row of the youth center's multipurpose room, watching kids practice for their upcoming talent show. His Saturday morning community service had become something he actually looked forward to, though he'd never admit it to anyone at the department. Officer K called out one of the younger kids, running up to show him a drawing. "Look what I made." The artwork showed a police officer helping someone cross the street. 6 weeks ago, the same kid had refused to even look at him, hiding behind his older brother whenever Keller was around. The change hadn't happened overnight. It had taken weeks of showing up, of proving he was there to help, of earning their trust one small interaction at a time. "That's really good," Keller smiled, meaning it. "The police officer's even wearing a badge just like mine." "Yeah, because you're one of the good ones now," the kid said with the simple honesty only children possess, before running back to his friends. The words hit Keller harder than he expected. One of the good ones now? How many times had he used that phrase himself, but in a completely different context? Later that afternoon, during his diversity training session, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly community leader who ran the programs, noticed his distraction. "Something on your mind, Officer Keller?" He shared what the kid had said. Mrs. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, her gray hair catching the afternoon light. "Words have power," she said, adjusting her glasses. "They can hurt, heal, or teach, sometimes all three at once." She pulled out a thick photo album from her desk. "Let me show you something." The album contained newspaper clippings from the 1960s, protests, police confrontations, civil rights marches. But mixed in were also photos of black and white officers working together, community meetings, progress being made step by step. "My husband was one of the first black officers in this city," she explained. He faced discrimination from both sides, white officers who didn't want him there, and community members who saw him as a traitor. But he kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept proving that change is possible. Keller thought about his own journey over the past 3 months. The uncomfortable conversations with Officer Washington during their patrols. The community meetings where people shared their experiences with police bias. The weekly check-ins with Chief Richardson, who pushed him to dig deeper into his prejudices. "I used to think I was one of the good ones," Keller admitted. 20 years on the force, decorated officer doing my job. But I never really looked at how I was doing it, or who I was hurting along the way. His radio crackled, a call about a disturbance at a local store. As Keller and Washington responded, they found a situation eerily similar to the one that had started all this. A well-dressed black man being accused of suspicious behavior by the store owner. Washington watched silently as Keller handled the situation. This time, Keller listened to both sides. He spoke respectfully, asked questions instead of making assumptions. It turned out the man was a new professor at the local college, looking for classroom supplies. "I apologize for any inconvenience, sir," Keller said, handing back the man's ID. "Would you like me to speak with the store owner about what happened here?" The professor looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Yes, officer. I would appreciate that." Back in the patrol car, Washington finally spoke. "You handled that well. 3 months ago, I probably would have been the one causing the problem instead of solving it," Keller admitted. "That's called growth," Washington replied. "But the real test isn't how do you act when you know I'm watching, it's what you do when nobody's looking." That evening, Keller had his bi-weekly meeting with Chief Richardson. The office felt different now, Less intimidating, more like a place of guidance than judgment. Your progress reports have been positive, Richardson said, reviewing the files. Officer Washington speaks highly of your recent work, and Mrs. Thompson says you're really engaging with the training. It's changing how I see things, Keller responded. Not just on the job, but everywhere. Last week, my daughter asked why I was different lately. Said I seemed more present. Richardson smiled slightly. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to start climbing back up. But the real question is, what happens after these 6 months are over? I've been thinking about that, Keller said. The youth center needs volunteer mentors for their after-school program. Even after my community service hours are done, I'd like to keep working with them. Good, Richardson nodded. Because this isn't about checking boxes or serving time. It's about becoming the kind of officer this community needs. Driving home that night, Keller passed the spot where he'd confronted Richardson 3 months ago. The memory still filled him with shame, but now it was mixed with something else. Gratitude for the wake-up call that had forced him to change. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. Can I come over this weekend? Want to show you my science project. 3 months ago, she'd been too embarrassed to tell her friends he was a cop. Now she was choosing to spend time with him again. Small steps, but in the right direction. As Keller pulled into his driveway, he noticed his elderly neighbor struggling with some groceries. Before, he might have just walked past, too wrapped up in his own problems. Tonight, he stopped to help and ended up hearing stories about her grandchildren, her concerns about neighborhood safety, her hopes for the community. It wasn't just about being a better police officer anymore. It was about being a better human being, one small interaction at a time. 5 months into the program, on a humid summer evening, Officer Keller's radio crackled with a call that would test everything he'd learned. A disturbance outside the local mall, reports of a group of teenagers causing trouble. The description mentioned young black males in hoodies. Want me to take this one? Officer Washington asked from the driver's seat. They both knew why he was offering. No, Keller replied, adjusting his body camera. I need to handle this. As they pulled into the mall parking lot, Keller saw 4 teenagers walking away from the main entrance. One of them looked familiar. A kid from the youth center wearing a basketball jersey under his hoodie. The store security guard was following them, speaking angrily into his radio. Evening, folks, Keller called out, stepping from the patrol car. He kept his voice calm, his hands visible. Mind if we talk for a minute? The teenagers stopped, their bodies tense. Keller recognized their expressions, the same mix of fear and defiance he'd seen hundreds of times before. But now he understood it differently. We didn't do anything, one of them said, his voice trying to sound tough but trembling slightly. That guy's been following us since we walked in. The security guard rushed over. These punks were causing trouble in the electronics store. Acting suspicious, touching everything. When I asked them to leave, they got attitude. 5 months ago, Keller would have automatically sided with the guard. He would have seen 4 black teenagers in hoodies and made immediate assumptions. But now he saw something else. Kids who looked like the ones he mentored at the youth center, who had dreams and fears and families who loved them. Sir, Keller addressed the guard, could you explain exactly what made their behavior suspicious? The guard faltered. Well, they were looking at the expensive headphones, moving in a group. One of them had his hands in his pockets. So they were shopping, Keller said quietly, like any other customers. He turned to the teenagers, recognizing the youth center kid, Thomas, who helped tutor younger children in math. Thomas, right? How's that calculus test coming up? The tension in Thomas's shoulders eased slightly. Got it next week. Officer K been studying hard. The other teens looked confused at the exchange. The security guard's mouth opened and closed without words. Here's what we're going to do, Keller announced. I'm going to review the store's security footage. If these young men did something wrong, we'll handle it. But if they were just shopping while being black, then we have a different kind of problem to address. The store footage showed exactly what the teens had said. They were shopping normally, trying on headphones, discussing prices. The only suspicious behavior was the guard following them constantly. Sir, Keller told the guard afterward, I need to file a report about this incident. But it won't be about these young men. It will be about potential racial profiling and harassment. The mall management might want to schedule some training sessions. As the teenagers left, Thomas hung back. Thanks, Officer K didn't expect, well, you know. I know, Keller nodded. And I'm sorry. Both for today and for all the times officers like me made you feel unwelcome in your own community. Back in the patrol car, Washington was smiling. You handled that perfectly, especially the body camera part. Keller touched the camera on his uniform. He'd made sure it was running the whole time, capturing everything. Learned that from you. Best way to protect everyone is to document everything. Chief's going to want to see this footage, Washington said. It's a good teaching moment for the department. Later that night, reviewing the incident report in his office, Chief Richardson leaned back in his chair. Do you realize what you did today? Handled a potential racial profiling situation. Keller suggested. You showed what real change looks like, Richardson corrected. 5 months ago, you were the one making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Today, you stopped someone else from doing the same thing. The chief pressed a button on his computer, playing the body camera footage. Watch how you approach them, calm, respectful, no hand near your weapon. Listen to how you spoke to both sides, gathered evidence before making judgments. This is exactly the kind of policing we need. I had good teachers, Keller said, thinking of Washington's patience, Mrs. Thompson's wisdom, and the chief's belief in second chances. The real test wasn't just how you handled the situation, Richardson noted. It was when you handled it that way. You didn't do it because you were being watched or evaluated. You did it because it was right. As Keller drove home that night, he passed the mall again. Through the windows, he could see other teenagers shopping, laughing, just being kids. Before, he might have seen potential troublemakers. Now he saw young people who deserved to feel safe and respected in their own community. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. Youth Center talent show tomorrow. You still coming to help? Wouldn't miss it, Keller replied, smiling. The transformation wasn't complete. He knew he still had work to do, prejudices to overcome, trust to rebuild. But today had shown him how far he'd come. More importantly, it had shown him why the journey mattered. Looking in his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. The face looking back at him wasn't just a police officer anymore. It was someone working to become part of the solution, one interaction at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning when Officer Keller spat on the man who would become his chief. The department's main conference room was packed for the annual community relations meeting, with both police officers and community members filling every seat. Chief Richardson stood at the podium, his presence commanding the room's attention. A year ago, I took over this department with a vision of change. Today, I want to share a story of transformation that proves change is possible when we choose accountability over punishment, understanding over ignorance. Keller shifted in his seat, knowing what was coming. His daughter sat beside him, squeezing his hand supportively. She'd started coming to these meetings 3 months ago, proud of the work her father was doing. Officer Keller, Richardson called out, "Would you join me up here?" Walking to the front of the room felt different than it had a year ago. The faces watching him weren't filled with judgment anymore, but with something closer to respect. He'd earned that, day by day, interaction by interaction. Many of you know Officer Keller's story, Richardson continued. Some of you were skeptical when I gave him a second chance. Others thought I was crazy. A gentle laugh rippled through the room. But today, I'm proud to announce that Officer Keller will be heading our new community relations unit. Applause filled the room, led by Officer Washington in the front row. Mrs. Thompson from the youth center wiped away a tear, beaming like a proud mother. This unit, Richardson explained, will focus on building bridges between law enforcement and our community. It will oversee training programs, youth outreach, and community engagement initiatives. And who better to lead it than someone who has lived the journey from bias to understanding? Keller stepped up to the microphone, his hands steady. A year ago, I was the problem. I was an officer who let prejudice poison my badge. I stood on these steps and committed an act of hate against a man who would become not just my chief, but my mentor. He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, fellow officers, community members, young people from the youth center. The easy path would have been to fire me. I deserved it. But Chief Richardson chose a harder path, the path of transformation. He believed that if one officer could change, others could too. Pulling a folded paper from his pocket, Keller continued. Last week, a young man at the youth center wrote this about his experience with police. He said, "I used to think all cops were against us. But then I met Officer K, who showed me that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define you, that bridges can be built where walls once stood." In the back of the room, Thomas, now headed to college on a mathematics scholarship, nodded in acknowledgement. He'd become a regular at the youth mentorship program Keller still ran, even after his required service hours were complete. "This new unit isn't just about community relations," Keller explained. "It's about honest conversations, about facing our biases, about doing the hard work of real change. Every officer will go through enhanced training, not just about what not to do, but about why it matters. They'll work directly with community members, learning their stories, understanding their perspectives." Chief Richardson stepped back to the podium. Officer Keller's transformation isn't just a personal victory. It's a model for what police reform can look like when we combine accountability with opportunity, when we face our failures and learn from them. After the meeting, officers and community members mingled, sharing refreshments and conversation. Keller watched as his daughter chatted with Mrs. Thompson, discussing her plans to study criminal justice in college. "Proud day," Officer Washington said, joining him. "You earned this." "Couldn't have done it without you as my partner," Keller replied. "Your patience, your guidance." "Save the speech," Washington smiled. "Just make it count." Later that evening, Keller stood in the exact spot where he'd confronted Chief Richardson a year ago. The setting sun cast long shadows across the steps, but they didn't look like prison bars anymore. They looked like bridges, stretching out toward a future he never imagined possible. His phone buzzed, a text from the youth center. The kids wanted to throw a celebration for his new position. They were already planning performances and speeches. As he walked to his car, Keller passed a rookie officer helping an elderly black woman with her groceries. The officer didn't know anyone was watching. He was just doing what was right. Maybe some changes were taking root beyond his own transformation. At home, Keller added a new photo to his album, him and Chief Richardson shaking hands at the ceremony, both smiling. Next to his police academy graduation photo, it told a story of not just a career, but a journey of redemption. His daughter was staying over, working on a paper about police reform for her senior project. "Dad," she called from the living room, "can I interview you for my paper?" About how real change happens. Keller smiled, remembering Richardson's words from a year ago. "Change isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary." "Sure," he replied, joining her on the couch. "Let's talk about how change begins with facing the truth about ourselves." Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, unaware that within its police department, a small revolution of understanding was taking root, one changed heart at a time.